Good morning, y'all. It's good to see everyone this morning and good to be back with you today. Hope everybody's having a great week and that things are going well for you and your families, that you're staying safe and staying well. Hopefully, also, by now, you saw the email that I sent out earlier in last week on Thursday and the Facebook post that put out our reading schedule. If you didn't see that, it's all right. It's certainly not too late. But I've supplied you with a few readings for each week that hopefully you can spend some time reading and thinking about before we come together on Sunday mornings for these classes. Those readings are going to correspond to what we're talking about in class, and sometimes they're going to be such that they're passages that I'm going to talk about in class, but maybe because of their length, we won't have time to actually read together. So I hope you will read along with us as we study through these foundations of faith. You know, when we were doing Genesis, it was easy because you knew what chapter was coming next. And I know a number of y'all were reading Genesis along with me as we were studying and reading ahead before we got there, so you were ready for us to come to class. And I hope that you will continue to do the same thing with us in this class as we are thinking about these foundational ideas within our faith. Well, this morning we come to the next of these big ideas. Last week as we kicked off our class, we were looking at Jesus the Christ. And remember, we talked about how that word "the" is very important because Christ is not his last name, it is his title. It is a description of who he is, Jesus the Christ, the Messiah. And as we look at and think about and thought about Jesus the Christ and the Messiah, we reflected upon him as the very center and the foundation of our faith. How everything we're going to look at in the rest of our time together this quarter on Sunday morning comes back to Jesus because he is the starting point and the end point. The Hebrew writer says he is the author and perfecter of our faith. But this morning, as we continue our study, we're going to look at the idea of covenant. Covenant. Covenant is one of those, I think the word covenant is one of those things that we talk about a lot. But maybe we don't fully understand, or maybe we do, but I think it's something we struggle with in our lives. But the reality is that for us as Christians, biblical religion is covenant religion. Biblical history is punctuated by God's covenants with individuals and peoples, and the teachings of the Old and the New Testaments are set in a covenant framework. If we are going to understand what it means to be people of faith, real, genuine, biblically grounded faith, we have to understand what it means to be people living in a covenant. So the question then is, what is a covenant? What is a covenant? Well, a covenant can simply be defined as a relationship based upon promises or sworn oaths. A relationship based upon promises or sworn oaths. It's something where a relationship is built and it is cemented by promises on the parts of both sides. Or they make solemn and sworn oaths about things they are going to do. It is a relationship that is built upon shared promises and commitments. In the ancient Near Eastern world of the Israelites, there were a number of different types of covenants. In Scripture, we see some things that would be what we call parity covenants. A parity covenant was made between equals, made between two people of roughly the same stature. And these are the kinds of covenants that, like Abraham would make with people that we talked about in our study of Genesis over the last 6 months. And so there are some covenants that exist between equal parties. Most covenants, however, in the ancient Near Eastern world were made between a sovereign power and his subordinates, or between different nations. So as we think about the Israelites and they're engaging and living in this world, and the idea of covenant first begins to emerge in Scripture, Most of the way they would have understood covenants in their society was as a series of relationships made between a ruler and his people or between different nations. These types of covenants were commonly signified by things like charters, treaties, and loyalty oaths. And we get this, right? We still see these kinds of things. Two nations may sign a treaty, a written agreement in which they agree to abide by certain terms, and in doing so it establishes a relationship. Loyalty oaths, where one group of people pledges their loyalty to a king in exchange for the king providing certain things, generally protection and things like that. So there are these different types of covenants. But as we begin to think about covenants and watch and examine how they play out in Scripture, many of the covenants that we begin to see in the Old Testament are going to be covenants in which God binds himself to a person or people and their descendants through an oath. They are going to be relationships, covenants, that God initiates and binds himself to those people through an oath. For instance, there's the covenant with Abraham that we talked so much about in our class on Genesis. In Genesis chapter 12, beginning there in verse 1, we'll read these words again that by now should be very familiar to you. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." We again see that covenant fleshed out even more in Genesis chapter 17, which hopefully you read before class today. And in that text there in Genesis 17, that's where we see circumcision added as the sign of that covenant. But in this covenant with Abraham, we see that God promised several things to Abraham. He promised to bless him, to bless the world through him, to make him the father of many nations, to give him his people an inheritance and a land, a place that would be theirs. And it was indeed circumcision that became the sign of this covenant for generations to come. And we know how significant of a promise and a covenant with Abraham that was, because we still see it playing out. We still see that God is faithful to that covenant to all of us as heirs, spiritual heirs to the promise of Abraham. But God doesn't just make a covenant with Abraham. As we think about covenants in the Old Testament, we're also reminded that God made a covenant with David. That God made a covenant with David. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, beginning there in verse 11, God says, "And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. Whenever he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the Son of Men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." God made a covenant promise to David. He promised to preserve the throne of David for all of his descendants. The prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah will take this promise of God as one of the key elements of the messianic hope for Israel's future, that God will indeed be faithful to his covenant promise to David, because that's who God is, a God who is faithful to covenant promises. And if our study of Genesis taught us anything, it should be that. Beyond just this covenant with Abraham, these covenants with Abraham and David, though, we also see in Exodus 19 and in Exodus 34 that God gave a covenant to Israel. And he did it through Moses. This Mosaic covenant, this Sinai covenant, is critical. Because here in Exodus 19 and Exodus 34, which I hope you've looked at, we find that it was on the basis of God's deliverance of Israel from Egyptian bondage at the Red Sea that God offered a covenant relationship to the people. And here, for the first time, we see God add requirements to that covenant. He required that they obey His voice. But as Mike was talking about in his sermon, we need to be reminded that obedience to the commands of God should flow out of gratitude. The people of Israel, out of gratitude and out of their experience of God as a gracious and merciful God, bound themselves to keep the words of God before they even knew what those commandments were. At this point, they didn't know what the commandments were going to be, but they knew that God had delivered them. And they were content to obey His words as long as He was their God. In this regard, though, it's important for us to note that there's a distinction between a covenant and a law. We oftentimes like to talk about the old covenant and the old law. The old covenant was the relationship. A covenant is the relationship itself, the agreement that binds the two parties together. A law is the terms of that covenant. So, the people of Israel are given the law of Moses. Those are the terms of the covenant. That's what they must do to fulfill their end of the covenant relationship. But it is not the same thing as a covenant. The covenant is the actual relationship. The promise that I will be your God and you shall be my people. That's the covenant. The law was what the people were expected to do under the terms of the covenant. Yet it's still worth noting that according to Deuteronomy chapter 7, the people had been chosen by grace. God enters into a covenant relationship with the Israelites not on the basis of their own merit. In Deuteronomy 7, we see that they were the fewest of all the earth, but the Lord loved them. In that same passage in Deuteronomy 7, Moses reminds them of God's past faithfulness and states, "Know therefore the Lord your God is God, the faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love Him and keep His commandments to 1,000 generations, and repays to their face those who hate Him by destroying them." Now, those of you who have studied any Old Testament with me or on your own, a lot of you have studied Old Testament books with me here at Farmington. But to those of you who've studied any Old Testament books, you know that Israel did in fact turn on God. It was only because of the covenant, though, that God made with Abraham that they were shown grace during their disobedience. The covenant remained because of God's faithfulness, not because of Israel's obedience. Israel is not always going to live up to their ends of the covenant agreement, but God remains faithful. Because that is who God is, and that is the agreement that He made with Abraham, the covenant He entered into with the great patriarch. But for all that we find about this old covenant, this Mosaic covenant, and what it indeed meant for the people of Israel, God also was pointing to a new covenant. And in Jeremiah, the 31st chapter, beginning there in verse 31, we find this prophecy. "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me. from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. This new covenant that Jeremiah prophesies about, that God foretells here, would not be like the Mosaic covenant. Yes, it would still result in the creation of a covenant people for whom they would be God's people and He would be their God. The same thing He had told the people of Israel at Sinai. But this covenant was going to be fundamentally different. Under the new covenant, Jeremiah tells us that the law would be written within, on man's heart rather than on tablets of stone. Additionally, this covenant relationship would be based upon God's forgiveness of their sins. The consequence of everyone knowing the Lord indicates that instead of coming into a covenant relationship by natural birth, which was how an Israelite entered into the covenant family of God by being born to the Hebrew people, under this new covenant, one would enter by a conscious choice based on the personal knowledge of the Lord. This new covenant would be one that people chose to enter into, and they would choose to do so because they personally knew God. He had written the law on their heart, and He would forgive their sins. Jeremiah and Ezekiel will flesh these ideas on the new covenant out further in several places. But the cumulative effect of reading about the foretelling of this new covenant is that it ultimately helps us to see that this new covenant is going to have as its essence the forgiveness of sin, and it will be sealed and signified by the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. That God will indeed dwell within man. And so it's in this context of foretelling of this new covenant that we come to Matthew chapter 1. And in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1, we are introduced to the fulfillment of the covenants of the Old Testament in Jesus. There we read these words, Jesus the Messiah, the Son of David, the Son of Abraham. Jesus became the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham to bless the world through him. He was the fulfillment of the covenant of the Davidic covenant in which a son of David would be placed on the throne forever. He was the king who would rule forever. Furthermore, Paul connects us to these covenants in his own writings as Paul reminds us that all of us who have put on Christ have become heirs of Abraham according to the promise. We have become part of God's promise to bless the generations of Abraham. Jesus himself knew that he was the fulfillment of this covenant, though. In Matthew 26:28, as he instituted the Lord's Supper, he refers to the cup as representing the blood of the covenant for the forgiveness of sins. A clear allusion to the text of Jeremiah 31. The Hebrews writer in Hebrews 7 through 9 furthermore goes to great lengths to show Jesus as the sacrificial lamb, the new high priest, and the mediator of this new covenant. Again, reminding us that it is in Jesus whom the covenant was fulfilled. Furthermore, after Jesus left, he sent the Holy Spirit, which according to 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 2, writes the law of God on our hearts. Again, taking us back to Jeremiah 31 and God's promise to give a new covenant and a new people for whom the law of God is written on their hearts. But when we talk about a new covenant, it inherently implies that there is an old covenant that's no longer current and that's no longer the current and effective covenant. If I say I got a new car, it means I got rid of the one I had before. I now have an old car. It's not the current one. It was what came before. And so in this case, that's what we see here with the covenant. There is a new covenant that means the old one has been replaced. In Galatians chapter 3, which I hope you have read for today, we see this idea that the old law was sent as a schoolmaster. The old covenant existed as a schoolmaster, a tutor, a disciplinarian, as some translations say, to remind us and prepare us and teach us what was coming in the new covenant, but that was never intended to be permanent. Christ replaced the old covenant and the old law. Remember, the law were the terms of the covenant. Christ replaced the old covenant and with it the old law, those terms of the covenant, with a new covenant and a new law. That new law, of course, that James calls the perfect law of liberty. This new law was made possible by a new priesthood. A priesthood of Christ, our new high priest, which is made explicit in Hebrews chapter 7 and further expanded upon in Hebrews chapters 8 and 9 as we read about the priesthood of Melchizedek. Paul, in his writings, also repeatedly focuses on the distinct nature of the two covenants, going so far as to declare that the tablets of stone had been nailed to the cross. Again, reminding us that in Jesus at the cross, a new covenant with a new law was instituted. The old covenant that was done away with, however, is the Mosaic covenant. It's important that we understand, however, that some of these Old Testament covenants are still in effect. The Abrahamic covenant and the Davidic covenant were both still in effect in that Christ fulfilled those promises. Furthermore, we see in Galatians 3 that we who are in Christ are Abraham's offspring. In this sense, we are still the recipients of the blessings of the covenant that God made with Abraham in Genesis 12. Only now, how one becomes a descendant of Abraham has changed. It is not by birth, and it is not signified by circumcision physically, but by choice. And it's signified by the circumcision of our hearts that comes through baptism. Regardless, what is clear is that Christ brought a new covenant, a new relationship based upon new terms of the promise. And as a result, the terms of that relationship between God and the people of His covenant were different. I do want to pause for just a minute, however, and acknowledge that just because the Old Covenant was done away with, it does not mean that the Old Testament was done away with and therefore has no value to us as Christians living under a new covenant. In fact, sometimes I think we in churches of Christ in particular are guilty of this because we want to talk about being New Testament Christians. Well, the implication of being a New Testament Christian is that the Old Testament doesn't really matter. And folks, I've heard people in our own congregation say things that amount to the same, to imply the Old Testament doesn't matter. But folks, that could not be further from the truth. In fact, what I think we see from Scripture is quite the opposite perspective. It shows us, the Old Testament shows us the nature of God. It introduces us to the God that we serve. It introduces us to what covenant looks like. It shows us what He expects of a covenant people. The Old Testament points us to the Christ. It points us to Jesus. It lays the foundation and helps us understand so much of what our new covenant is. Because the new covenant and the new law take things that were part of the old covenant and the old law and updates them and gives them a new thing, but still connect back to those ideas. We will never be able to understand the Lord's Supper until we understand Passover. We will never be able to understand baptism until we understand circumcision. We will never be able to understand the sacrifice of Jesus until we understand the blood sacrifice required for the atoning of sins in the Old Testament. No, just because the old covenant was done away with, it doesn't mean that the Old Testament doesn't matter. Well, this idea of covenant is inherently tied to the idea of a community. Because what we know is that a covenant is a relationship. A covenant is a relationship based upon promises. And in doing so, for there to be a covenant, it creates a covenant people. In the case of the Mosaic covenant and the covenant with Abraham, a people were created by virtue of the covenant. There would have been no people of God without the covenant. There would be no children of God without the covenant. Furthermore, we are reminded that this covenant of God has always been a covenant of grace, in which God does for the people of His covenant what they could not do for themselves. The people of Israel could have never done anything on their own merit to warrant the blessings of God. We today could never do on our own or achieve on our own what we are given in the covenant. You see, our new covenant is a covenant of forgiveness. And hence this new covenant people of God is a forgiven people on whose hearts the laws of God are written. We could never on our own forgive our sins. We on our own could never be made whole and pure and righteous. But God is and always has been a God who shows grace through His covenant. And now, as people of the new covenant, we are a forgiven people on whose hearts God has written His law. The church is that new covenant people. We are the ones who have entered into the covenant with God, and that is more than a legal relationship. It is a love relationship. It is a love relationship. And what we see in this is that because God shows love to us and we love Him, we meet our ends of the covenant. It's the same way with marriage. Our marriage relationships are covenants of love. Yes, they are legal. Yes, we sign certificates and we have marriage licenses and all of those things that prove we are legally married. But a marriage that is biblical, that is true, is a covenant of love, where both sides operate out of love for the other to meet their ends of the covenant. And so it is with us and God. But as we think about this covenant, we need to more than anything remember that that covenant was made possible because of Jesus. The church may be the covenant people, but the covenant is only possible because of Jesus the Christ. Without Jesus, there is no relationship, and without a relationship, there is no church. So as we saw last time, and as I told you, as we move through our time together and reflect upon these major ideas, they always come back to Jesus. This morning we've been looking at and thinking about and talking about what it means to be in covenant. What it means that we as a people are in a relationship with God. One that is founded upon promises. God promises to be our God. He promises to forgive our sins. And in return, He asks us to, out of love and gratitude for what He has done, obey and submit to Him. But that covenant could not exist without Jesus, because it is Jesus through whom the covenant is fulfilled and that our relationship is founded upon. As we think about these foundational ideas of faith, may we live each day mindful of the covenant relationship we have with God. May we be people who strive to show our gratitude and our love for God and for His Son through our humble obedience to His covenant.